The media fixates on North Korea's missile launches, framing them as the primary event. This is a fundamental misreading of the strategic landscape. These tests, and Turkey's development of systems like the Cyper-1, are not the core threat. They are the advertisement, a noisy distraction designed to draw your eye to the sky. The real vector for systemic disruption is silence. Analysts at CSIS confirm the primary asymmetric vulnerability is the global network of sub-sea fiber optic cables. Cutting these arteries doesn't require a nuclear arsenal. It requires a specialized submersible. The objective is not kinetic destruction, but a global liquidity seizure, to turn the digital nervous system of finance and military command off. The second vector is orbital, targeted satellite blinding, a non-kinetic strike that renders GPS and C4ISR networks inert. This protocol creates the blind Leviathan, a superpower with overwhelming kinetic force but zero situational awareness. A panicked, sightless giant is not a deterrent. It is a liability, mathematically forced into a launch-on-warning posture with no incoming data. It becomes the single greatest accelerant for miscalculation and escalation. The invasion was not an act of strength. It was a declaration of bankruptcy. When a state's balance sheet is collapsing, it cannot afford a long, conventional war. It becomes a domestic liability. The motive is pure mathematics. A solvency crisis forces a pivot to asymmetry. Analysts at CSIS have been direct. The war became a critical domestic liability for Russia. Facing mounting economic pressure and eroding popular support, the Kremlin's calculus shifted from conventional engagement to asymmetric survival. The state's internal weakness, not its external ambition, became the primary accelerant. This is the blueprint for a solvency war. The objective is not territory alone, but the kinetic restructuring of liabilities. When your currency is under siege and your core assets are sanctioned into junk status, you are forced to create new assets. Seizing industrial zones and energy infrastructure is a desperate, high-risk attempt to recapitalize a failing state enterprise. Weakness mandates a launch-on-warning protocol. The shift to a kinetic campaign was a calculated response to the certainty of systemic decay. Unable to compete within the established financial system, a system increasingly anchored to unreliable assets like German bonds, the only remaining vector is to break the system itself. Asymmetry is the final tool of a state with nothing left to lose. The math of modern warfare is no longer complex. It is brutal and binary. The Royal United Services Institute, RUSI, frames the core equation. A $5 million main battle tank, a pinnacle of industrial-era power, can now be systematically neutralized by a $500 first-person view drone. This is not a balanced fight. It is an economic execution. The kinetic cost to destroy a strategic asset has collapsed by a factor of 10,000. This inversion of cost creates a dynamic strategic analysts refer to as the democratization of violence. The monopoly on high-impact kinetic force, once held exclusively by nation-states with massive industrial bases, has been broken. The barrier to entry for asset liquidation is now the price of a consumer electronic device. A state, or even a non-state actor, can now achieve strategic effects that were previously unimaginable without a legacy air force or armored division. This is not a technological curiosity. It is a direct consequence of systemic financial decay. When the promise of stable returns from core assets like German bonds evaporates, states on the periphery are forced into a corner. They cannot afford the legacy model of defense. Instead, they are mathematically driven to pursue asymmetric leverage. This cheap, scalable lethality becomes their primary tool for strategic autonomy and survival in a zero-sum game. Do not mistake regional instability for the root cause. It is a symptom. CSIS and RUSI analysts identify zones like South Africa and even Canada not as epicenters of chaos, but as proxy laboratories. These are staging grounds. sandboxes for testing the protocols of a new era of conflict. While the legacy system fixates on the core solvency crisis, the mathematical certainty of German bond markets becoming a liability, new vectors of asymmetric warfare are being calibrated in the periphery. These are not random riots or political failures. They are calculated experiments in supply chain severance, engineered social fractures, and testing the kinetic cost of maintaining order when the financial anchor has failed. This is the blueprint for a decentralized, zero-sum environment where strategic autonomy is no longer a choice, but a function of survival. The ultimate asymmetric vector is not kinetic. It is digital. The launch-on-warning protocol is a relic from an era of trusted systems, dictating an immediate retaliatory strike upon detection of an inbound enemy launch. The logic is cold. Absorb a first strike, and you lose the capacity to respond. The entire framework, however, hinges on a single, now obsolete assumption that the early warning data is real. RUSI and CSIS analysts warn that the primary objective in a systemic conflict is to blind the network. A targeted cyber attack creates an existential paradox for the command authority. When the screens go dark, is it a system failure or a decapitation strike in progress? In this fog of digital war, the commander is forced into a zero-sum calculation based on fear. The protocol mathematically compels a launch decision based on the absence of information, a response triggered not by an actual missile, but by a ghost in the machine. The repricing of German sovereign debt is not a market adjustment. It is a solvency crisis masquerading as a yield curve. As source number 1 documents, capital is fleeing German bonds, erasing the risk premium that once defined European economic stability. This systemic decay is the primary accelerant for states on the periphery. They understand the core asset is now a liability. Their response is a mathematical certainty, the pursuit of strategic autonomy and kinetic leverage. Observe the vectors. Turkey completes acceptance tests on its Cyper-1 air defense system, decoupling its security from traditional alliances. North Korea explicitly links its missile launches to the recent geopolitical crisis, weaponizing instability for leverage. These are not isolated events. They are symptoms of a collapsing financial hierarchy, forcing nations to acquire hard assets and the demonstrated will to use them. The logical conclusion is a calibration shot, a deniable, non-lethal strike with maximum economic impact, designed to test response protocols. CSIS analysts have modeled this exact scenario. Therefore, the forecast is precise. Within the next 12 months, a Tier 1 European container port, likely Hamburg or Rotterdam, will suffer a 48 to 72-hour total logistics blackout. All automated cranes, shipping databases, and berthing systems will simultaneously fail. The event will be attributed publicly to a cascading software failure or a sophisticated ransomware attack. This provides plausible deniability. The objective is not destruction, but a launch-on-warning signal demonstrating the kinetic cost of financial exclusion. It is a non-attributable message, a price-setting mechanism for a new era of zero-sum conflict.